So this is the third Sunday in our sermon series on the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. And Jeff will actually be back next week to finish up the series. He's down east doing a family wedding. This Sunday, I'm preaching on science fiction, which means we're mostly back in Revelation. Now, I'm pretty sure that there are a few of you out there thinking, well, she's pretty much been preaching on science fiction for the last 2 weeks already. So what else is new? Well, not quite. Not quite. What I want to talk about today is the ways in which people have taken this idea of the end of the world as we know it and used that notion creatively. Excuse me. Because admittedly, that notion fires the imagination, which is not necessarily a bad thing, or at least not always a bad thing. Sometimes it is a bad thing. Sometimes it's a good thing. We'll get to that. First, slight review on apocalyptic literature. Once again, apocalypse means what? Uncovering. Slide, John. Thank you. It's a revelation, and apocalyptic literature tends to be produced by those who are persecuted. So the book of Revelation was written during persecution of the early church. The book of Daniel was written during the Babylonian captivity. Basically, some righteous minority thinks that it alone has the true path. It's very us versus them, and the thems, the bad ones, will get their just desserts in the coming conflict and chaos. And what this kind of literature revelates, is that there's a transcendent reality. There's something different or beyond this life and time. Different in terms of its temporal nature, as in not necessarily applying to this life, in that it envisions a final salvation at the end of time, but also different spatially, in that it envisions a different world, but another supernatural world, a world beyond this one, a world where the rules of this world don't necessarily apply. And that reveals, actually, a profound pessimism about this world. In other words, this world is so effed up that God just has to trash it. Which is a kind of disturbing notion if you think too hard about it. And I think one of the ways that people have coped with that notion over the course of human history is that they've tried to express creatively what that might look like to them. For instance, this is Michelangelo's painting of the Last Judgment. It's in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. Anybody been there, seen it? Yeah, it's cool, eh? Unfortunately, you can't see too much of the detail, even in the Sistine Chapel, but it portrays Christ judging all souls at the end of time, and at the very bottom, consigning some to hell while others ascend to heaven. As an aside, Michelangelo put the faces of people he didn't like on the folks heading to hell, and the faces of his patrons on the people going to heaven. And I think that's actually kind of typical of creative interpretations of the end of the world. The end of times also shows up creatively in music. Any Roman Catholics, ex-Catholics out there? Okay, ever been to a funeral mass? Few. How about a big fancy schmancy requiem mass? A few? Okay. The liturgy of the Roman Catholic Requiem Mass, as well as the liturgy for All Saints' Day, contains a poem called Dies Irae, which means Day of Wrath. And it describes the Last Judgment with a trumpet summoning souls before the throne of God, where the saved will be delivered and the unsaved cast into eternal flames. It's probably inspired by Revelation chapter 20. Now, you may have heard this sung in beautiful settings of the Mass by Mozart and Bach, Verdi, or Benjamin Britten's War Requiem. Yeah? Great music. Horrible thoughts. And the end of the world also shows up in literature besides the Bible. Now we're getting to the science fiction. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of my most favorite and least favorite end-of-the-world sci-fi. First, the least favorite. Have any of you heard of the Left Behind series of books by a guy named Tim LaHaye? Not too many, thank God, because it's junk. It's a series of 16 perplexingly best-selling books, religious novels by Tim LaHaye dealing with Christian dispensationalist end times, the pre-tribulation, premillennial Christian eschatological interpretation of the biblical apocalypse. Got it? No, huh? Now, I know that I just used a bunch of obscure theological terms that I would normally explain, or more normally just not use in the first place, but I'm not going to today because there's no point in you knowing or remembering them because they're mostly complete BS. Lightning? Sky's clear. Okay. So they are the product of a literal reading and some ignorant interpretation of some random, cherry-picked, unrelated biblical texts from different times by different authors with radically different purposes, all woven together to create a very strange worldview. In the novels, the notion of left behind is based on the rapture, which some Christians believe is a phenomenon of the end times where true believers in Jesus will be taken up to heaven before a period of earthly tribulation begins and they escape the coming chaos and Armageddon and the Antichrist and all that. Have any of you heard of the rapture? Anybody really wedded to that idea? Because I'm going to wreck it. The term rapture tends not to be discussed by serious theologians because, first of all, it appears nowhere in the Bible. While the idea of believers being caught up in the air is mentioned once in 1 Thessalonians 4:17, one single metaphorical verse, it's metaphorically describing the second coming. It is not, repeat, not, a claim or even an implication that Christians are going to disappear before all hell breaks loose on earth, literally. In fact, and I think this is probably the second biggest reason that great thinkers of the church don't talk about the rapture, the very idea of rapture is antithetical to the overarching narrative and meaning of Scripture. Why? Because the Bible is about a God who journeys with us through hard times. God doesn't pluck us out of danger. Whether that danger is slavery in Egypt, wandering in the wilderness, exile in Babylon, the travails of Job, oppression under the Romans, the persecution of the early church, God journeys with God's people through the valley of the shadow of death. God does not snatch us out of it. So if that's true, then the notion of the rapture reveals a lack of love for the very world Christ came to save. The very idea of the church abandoning the world in its time of need is endemic of a fundamentalist Christianity that's more focused on the self than on the other, more Gnostic, concerned with right ideas, than actually Christian, following the teachings of Jesus, and hyper-focused on the hereafter to the detriment of the here and now. And the idea of the rapture allows people to neglect the present world, to ignore, for instance, the fact that the Amazon rainforest is on fire, and let the world crumble away while we focus on our own eternal glory. Yeah, the second coming may be important, but so is everything that happens before it. And anticipating that reality encourages us to participate in God's restoration of creation by loving our world and loving our neighbors and living the abundant life that God intended for us. But perhaps the most important thing to remember is that the book of Revelation is not a roadmap to the future. It is a declaration that Christ will return, and then justice will be granted to the oppressed, and all things will be made new. And that may be happening all around us already, but it is not attempting to give precise details on how it's going to happen. In fact, it more supports the notion that Christ is already here among us, continually making all things new, God working in us and through us. Now for some good science fiction. This is a book by award-winning British authors Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. Anybody read anything by them? Anybody? A few? Good. Anybody ever read this?
Yes.
All righty. Loving it. Good stuff, eh? Yeah, okay. The late Terry Pratchett is the author of the Discworld fantasy series, which is super humorous, super witty. Neil Gaiman is known for numerous sci-fi novels, as well as some very cool graphic novels. And anybody seen the movie Coraline? He wrote that story. Both incredibly talented and imaginative. And together, they wrote this book called Good Omens, about the end of the world. And it is one of my favorite books of all time. It's basically a comedy about the birth of the son of Satan and the coming of the end times. And there are these two angels, representatives of heaven and hell on earth, named Aziraphale and Crowley, who over the course of human history have gotten quite used to life on earth and comfortably settled in England. And because they kind of like their lives, they get together to sabotage the coming of the end times. And there are a lot of interesting subplots, one of which features a mix-up at a little country hospital in England on the day the Antichrist is born, and a bunch of babies get switched at birth, and the Antichrist grows up in the wrong family in the wrong little country village, and he eventually raises Atlantis and summons little green men from Mars and incidentally prevents a nuclear holocaust. And there's another subplot concerning the summoning of 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Remember them from a couple of weeks ago? In the book, they turn out to be a small, bumbling motorcycle gang. It's just beautiful. It is fantastic in the truest sense of the word. And also, it's recently been made into a fabulous miniseries by BBC and Amazon, starring Michael Sheen and David Tennant of Doctor Who fame as the angels, and Frances McDormand plays the voice of God. I haven't seen, yeah, cool, eh? I haven't seen it yet, but I'm dying to. So as an aside, any tech-savvy millennial who can help me set up an Amazon Fire Stick on my TV so I can finally watch it, please see me after service, okay? I'm kind of a techno idiot. Now, some of you are thinking of leaving here and saying, Deana said the Bible is science fiction. For the record, I did not say that. I did not say that. I am not saying that. For all its foibles and for all of my foibles, I happen to love the Bible more than the average bear. The boomers will get that reference. I figure if I can be loved with all my faults, I'm looking at you, Janet, my beloved. If I can be loved, then I can love the Bible, even when I see how it's misinterpreted and misused, in my humble opinion, of course. For me, it's one pathway to God. It's even, as my Baptist Sunday school teacher said, a guide for life, just maybe not always in the way they meant. For me, it's a key to the abundant life that God desires for us, and for helping me understand the unconditionally loving nature of God. But I do still love sci-fi too. Now, you've often heard me quote one of my favorite spiritual writers, Bishop Stephen Charleston, and I want to close with a reflection of his. He's a Native American retired Episcopal bishop, Anglican, and I get his daily prayers and devotions on Facebook. If you're on Facebook, I recommend you seek him out, Stephen with a V. I didn't know this, but as it turns out, years ago, he also wrote some science fiction. And he posted this reflection the other day. He said, "When I wrote my science fiction novels, I'm sure some people thought it was only a lark. But sci-fi is where spirituality becomes prophetic. Consider the fact that one day soon, what we thought was fantasy will be our reality. Genetic engineering will be proliferating into all areas of life. Cloning will become more common. The resettlement of coastal populations from cities like New York will occur as sea levels rise. Serious efforts to mine the moon for precious metals will begin. The genetic enhancement of animals and even human beings will be an option many will want to embrace. The spiritual foundation we create today will be the ground for the spiritual activists of tomorrow." Let me repeat that. The spiritual foundation we create today will be the ground for the spiritual activists of tomorrow. This is no lark. Our prophets wear lab coats. And I would add, sometimes our prophets write sci-fi. And at their best, prophets don't necessarily give us a snapshot of what life will be, but they give us a touchstone for what could be if we participate with God in the recreation of the world. So let us go and do good work. Amen?
Amen.